Most people think of venture capital as a source of funding for technology startup companies. And there's some truth to that, because if you look at companies like Facebook or Netflix, Google, Apple even, they were all initially funded by venture capital. But not all companies that are funded by venture capital are in the technology space. So venture capital also launched companies like Starbucks, and in Africa, Balancel, Andela, Mr. Mac Learning. The bigger and better question is, when is venture capital the most suitable form of funding for a company? And the simple way to answer that is to say venture capital is a source of funding for companies that aren't otherwise good candidates to get funding from more traditional financial institutions. Institutions like banks who give loans. Bank loans aren't a permanent form of a company's capital structure. And for a startup, paying back a loan could end up being problematic. Often they're not just generating sufficient cash flows to service the interest and to pay back the capital on the loan. So banks are not suitable. Banks are also quite conservative in how they give loans. They want to take credit risk given the cash flows of a business and what it's going to generate in the future. And they're not expecting to be taking credit risk. So forecasting cash flows and a reasonable level of comfort in terms of future cash flows is important to banks, but it's virtually impossible when it's a startup. And if a loan was made, the bank would be exposed, as I said earlier, to equity risk as opposed to credit risk. Banks don't want to take equity risk. They only want to take credit risk. So banks often only want to give loans if they can be paid back within a 3 to 5 year time horizons. Now, investors in startups frequently have to wait much longer to finally get the original capital and any additional returns back paid to them. So startups, by their very nature, have a long illiquidity period. So if getting debt was viable, entrepreneurs could avoid and delay their equity dilution and retain total control of the company. Realistically, for most startups, this may not be a viable option. And because they require a permanent injection of capital in the form of equity to scale up to the next level, they resort to venture capital. So venture capital is simply equity financing that investors are willing to put into a startup, and they are prepared to do that on the assumption that they'll ultimately get paid for the risk that they're taking by way of massive appreciation in value of that startup. And in some instances, VCs invest in underlying companies in the form of notes that may look like debt. But in virtually all these instances, these notes are convertible into equity, and they are therefore more equity than debt in nature. So the convertibility of the notes to equity means the capital is effectively permanent in its substance despite its form. So this inevitably means bringing in venture capital as equity participants and being prepared to live with the involvement of other people in the business is very, very important for an entrepreneur. When people provide you with this capital, they're going to participate in the decisions of your company, they'll be participating in the board, and an entrepreneur has to be willing to live with this. Right. Importantly, venture capital firms don't just bring money to the game. They're also competing with other VC firms to get the best entrepreneurs coupled with the best business opportunities. So they add value, and they do this in different ways. They do this by, for instance, helping with business development. They do this by identifying potentially talented employees that could join the company or bring new executives into the business. They provide access to their contacts. They may serve on the board of the startup. They may provide other strategic advice and other general activities that help the company. They try and they add value. So what the best venture capital firms are doing is they're providing entrepreneurs with a network of people, a network of institutions that can really improve the startup's chances of success. And they can also help the founding CEO to become a world-class CEO through a combination of training, of networks, of additional funding, technology, marketing, and really just building a strong team around it.